They never heard you, they only heard what they wanted. I was never silent. That's the lie they tell themselves to sleep at night. I spoke, I explained, I bled in sentences. But you can scream for air underwater and still drown in front of people who swear they're listening. I was surrounded, faces everywhere, voices overlapping mine like static. They talked over me, not to me. They nodded at the right moments, pretended to care, pretended to understand. But they weren't listening, they were waiting. Waiting for their turn to talk, waiting for my weakness to slip through my words. They called it concern. That's how betrayal likes to dress itself, clean, polite, smiling. I'm just worried about you. We only want what's best. Maybe you're overthinking. That word was their favorite weapon. Every time I tried to explain the weight on my chest, they told me it wasn't that heavy. Every time I named the wound, they corrected the diagnosis. Every time I told the truth, they softened it until it meant nothing. They didn't want honesty. They wanted comfort, their comfort, and my truth made them uncomfortable. So they reshaped it, trimmed it, filtered it through their own fear, through their own guilt, through their own need to stay innocent. They didn't hear me. They heard the version of my words that let them walk away clean. I learned early what it feels like to be dismissed with a smile, to be invalidated politely, to be ignored without being abandoned. Because that kind of neglect cuts deeper. If they hated me openly, at least I'd know where I stood. But this was being erased while still standing in the room. I spoke carefully, chose my words like fragile glass, softened my pain so it wouldn't scare them, lowered my voice so it wouldn't threaten their peace. And still they flinched, they corrected, they minimized. I said I was hurting. They said I was sensitive. I said I felt betrayed. They said I misunderstood. I said something was wrong. They said I should be grateful. Grateful. For what? For being tolerated. For being heard only when I was agreeable. For being valued only when I was convenient. I learned something dangerous in those moments. I learned that speaking doesn't guarantee being heard, and honesty doesn't guarantee respect. I learned that some people don't listen to understand. They listen to control the narrative, to protect the version of themselves where they're never the villain. And every time I tried again, every time I opened my mouth hoping this time would be different, I felt it. That pressure, that resistance, like pushing against water that refuses to move, shouting underwater. You open your mouth, you scream, your lungs burn, your chest tightens, and all anyone sees is silence and bubbles. That's what it felt like to be me. I wasn't asking for agreement. I wasn't demanding loyalty. I wasn't begging to be saved. I just wanted to be heard without being corrected. Seen without being reshaped. Understood without being reduced. But that was too much. Because to hear me fully, they would have had to face themselves, their choices, their neglect, their quiet cruelty. And people will destroy the truth before they destroy their self-image. So they talked over me. They reframed my pain. They explained me to myself. And slowly, quietly, something shifted. Not anger, not rage, fatigue. A deep, bone-level exhaustion that comes from repeating yourself to walls that nod. That's when I realized something they never noticed. I wasn't unheard because I lacked clarity. I was unheard because clarity threatened them. My words weren't confusing. They were inconvenient, and standing there, surrounded, unseen, I felt the first crack form inside me. Not a break, a fracture. The kind that doesn't scream. The kind that goes quiet. The kind that remembers. And in that moment, without announcing it, without drama, without warning, I began to understand. If they could only hear what they wanted, then one day they would hear nothing at all. And that silence would speak louder than I ever could. When being honest became a liability, there was a time when I believed honesty was strength. I thought truth was armor. I thought if I spoke clearly, cleanly, without venom, I would be safe. I was wrong. Honesty didn't protect me. It painted a target on my back. Every truth I offered was weighed, measured, and quietly stored, not to understand me. Not to meet me halfway, but to use later. They didn't hear my honesty as courage. They heard it as opportunity. I opened my chest and they studied the anatomy. I named my fears and they memorized the coordinates. I admitted my doubts and they sharpened them into knives. That's when I learned the cruelest lesson of all. Vulnerability in the wrong hands becomes leverage. I spoke about my limits. They pushed there. I spoke about my pain. They pressed harder. I spoke about what mattered to me. They threatened it, not openly, not dramatically, quietly, casually, with smiles that never reached their eyes. They collected my words like ammunition, stored them away, waited for the right moment. And when the moment came, when I was tired, distracted, already bleeding, they fired. You said this once. You admitted that. You're contradicting yourself. No, I was evolving, but they needed me frozen. They needed my past words to outweigh my present growth. They needed consistency, not truth. Control, not honesty. So they punished me for being real. Every confession became a liability. Every explanation became evidence. Every attempt to clarify became another thread in the net tightening around me. And still, I tried. Because part of me believed that if I explained better, if I spoke softer, if I chose better words, they would finally understand. That hope nearly destroyed me. I kept talking while my body begged me to stop. I kept explaining while my energy drained away sentence by sentence. I kept offering truth to people who had already decided what to do with it. That's what emotional exhaustion really is. Not being tired, being depleted. It's waking up already drained. It's rehearsing conversations you'll never win. It's feeling your chest tighten every time you consider speaking, because experience has taught you the cost. They never paid for my honesty. I did. They never carried the weight of my words. I did. And one day, something inside me snapped, not loudly, not violently, but decisively. I realized something that changed everything. Honesty is only power when it's respected. In hostile territory, it's a liability. I saw the pattern clearly then. They didn't want truth, they wanted access. Access to my thoughts, my emotions, my intentions. Because once they had those, they could predict me, anticipate me, manipulate me. So I closed the door, not in anger, not in spite, in self-respect. I stopped offering explanations that would be weaponized. I stopped confessing to people who mistook openness for weakness. I stopped feeding those who survived on my emotional labor. And the silence that followed, it wasn't emptiness, it was relief. For the first time, my words belonged to me again. My thoughts were no longer public property. My truth was no longer up for cross-examination. Let them call it distant. Let them call it guarded. Let them call it cold. I know what it really is. It's discipline. It's awareness. It's the wisdom earned by being punished for honesty one too many times. So if you're listening to this, if you feel tired in your bones from explaining yourself, if your truth has been used against you more times than it's been honored, hear me. You don't owe clarity to those who profit from your confusion. You don't owe vulnerability to those who turn it into leverage. You don't owe honesty to people who treat it like ammunition. Protect your truth. Not everyone deserves access. And if that means speaking less, if that means choosing silence, so be it. Because the moment honesty became a liability, silence became strategy. They fed on your reactions. They didn't want resolution. They wanted reaction. That's the part they never admit, because parasites don't survive on truth, they survive on response. Every sigh you gave them was a meal, every explanation a feast, every emotional crack an invitation. They studied you closely, not to understand you. To learn which buttons made you move. Anger made them feel powerful. Sadness made them feel needed. Forgiveness made them feel untouchable. No matter what you gave them, they took more. You thought reacting meant you cared. They knew reacting meant they were winning. Rage didn't scare them, it energized them. Your raised voice gave them importance. Your tears gave them purpose. And when you tried kindness, when you tried understanding, when you tried forgiveness, they smiled. Because forgiveness without boundaries is permission, and they took it gladly. You apologized for things that weren't yours. You explained feelings they refused to feel. You bent so the tension would ease, but nothing changed. Nothing ever changed. They came back louder, colder, more entitled, because every reaction trained them, like animals learning where the food is. They learned that if they provoked you, you'd engage. If they disrespected you, you'd explain. If they crossed the line, you'd de-forgive. So they crossed it again. And again, different tactic, same hunger. They were emotional parasites living off the heat of your nervous system, feeding on your need to be understood, thriving on your refusal to walk away. And you felt it, that constant depletion, that exhaustion that no amount of sleep fixed. You weren't tired because life was hard. You were tired because you were being consumed. Every conversation left you emptier. Every conflict drained something vital. You walked away from them feeling smaller, even when you thought you'd done the right thing. That's when the patterns started to show. Not all at once, not dramatically, quietly. You noticed how problems only existed when you reacted, how chaos followed your emotional investment, how peace returned the moment you pulled back. You saw how they escalated when ignored, how they softened when you stopped feeding them, how they panicked when you stayed calm. That's when it hit you. They didn't care what you felt. They cared that you felt something, because emotion was leverage, emotion was access, emotion was control. You gave them rage, they used it. You gave them sadness, they exploited it. You gave them forgiveness, they disrespected it. Nothing you offered changed them, but everything you offered trained them. And that realization was brutal, because it meant the problem wasn't that you were too harsh or too sensitive or too emotional. The problem was that you were accessible, so you stopped. Not dramatically. Not loudly, you just didn't react. No explosion, no tears, no explanations. And suddenly, they didn't know what to do. They pushed harder, provoked deeper, crossed bigger lines, because starving parasites thrash before they die. But you stayed still. You watched them unravel without your energy. You saw how empty they were without your response, how powerless they became when you didn't move. That's when you understood the truth they fear most. Your reactions were never proof of weakness. They were proof of supply. And the moment you stopped feeding them, the moment you went quiet, the moment you stayed composed, the balance shifted. You weren't cold, you were controlled. You weren't detached, you were aware. You weren't passive, you were finished being consumed. So if you're listening to this now, if you feel drained after certain people, if conflict follows you only where you engage, understand this. Not every battle deserves your emotion. Not every provocation deserves your voice. Not every wound deserves your blood. Some people don't want peace, they want reaction. And denying them that's not weakness, that's starvation. And once you see the pattern, once you recognize who feeds on your reactions, you never unsee it. You don't argue with parasites, you don't explain yourself to them, you don't try to save them, you remove the supply. Let them provoke, let them accuse, let them twist the story, you stay still. Because the most terrifying thing you can do to someone who feeds on chaos is give them nothing at all. The loneliest place is being surrounded by pretenders. The loneliest place isn't isolation. It's being surrounded by people who clap for you with hollow hands. I learned that the hard way. They stood close, smiled wide, spoke loyalty like a language they'd memorized phonetically. But loyalty without action is theater. And I was standing in a room full of actors. They called themselves allies, friends, family, but their loyalty had conditions, invisible ones, unspoken ones. I was valued when I was useful, celebrated when I was convenient, praised when I made them look good. And the moment I stopped performing, silence. That silence didn't come from distance. It came from proximity, from people close enough to see the wound and choose not to look. They loved me when I was strong. They admired me when I was rising. They quoted me when I was winning, but when I needed support. When I slowed down, when the weight finally showed on my face, they vanished without leaving the room. That's the cruelty of fake loyalty. It doesn't leave, it just stops showing up. Conditional love is the quietest form of abandonment. No goodbye, no conflict, just absence disguised as patience. They'd say things like, "Let me know if you need anything." But when I did, their phones were silent, their schedules full, their concerns suddenly theoretical. They applauded the highlight reel, ignored the process. Loved the outcome, hated the cost. I noticed the pattern too late. Applause when I was useful, silence when I was hurting. They wanted the benefit of my strength without the responsibility of my humanity. So I learned to bleed quietly. I learned to suffer without witnesses, to rebuild without help, to carry weight without asking. Because asking revealed the truth. It revealed who needed me functional, not whole, who preferred me productive, not honest, who loved the role I played, but not the person underneath. They didn't want to see the cracks. Cracks made them uncomfortable. Cracks reminded them that strength has a price, so they pretended not to notice. And pretending hurts more than rejection, because rejection is honest. Pretending says, "I see you breaking and I choose not to care." That kind of loneliness changes you. It teaches you that company doesn't equal connection. That noise doesn't equal support. That being surrounded doesn't mean being seen. I was never alone in the room, but I was alone in the truth. And slowly, quietly, I stopped expecting warmth from cold hands. I stopped looking for understanding from people invested in misunderstanding me. I stopped confusing presence with loyalty. Because loyalty isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need applause. Loyalty stays when there's nothing to gain. It speaks when silence would be easier. It stands next to you when the crowd disappears. Most people couldn't do that, not because they were evil, because they were shallow. They wanted inspiration without responsibility, access without accountability, closeness without commitment. And when they couldn't have that, they withdrew emotionally while staying physically close. That's when I realized something important. Being surrounded by pretenders is more dangerous than being alone, because pretenders drain you slowly. They make you doubt yourself. They teach you to question your worth based on reaction, so I made a decision. I stopped performing for approval, stopped shrinking to stay included, stopped explaining my pain to people who only listened when it benefited them. I chose solitude over fake unity, clarity over comfort, truth over belonging. And yes, it was lonely, but it was honest, because real strength isn't built in applause, it's built in silence, in rooms where no one is watching, in moments where you stand without witnesses. So if you feel lonely surrounded by people, if you feel unseen despite the noise, if you feel exhausted trying to be enough for those around you, hear this. You're not broken, you're not ungrateful, you're not asking for too much. You're standing among pretenders, and walking away from them isn't failure, it's alignment. Because once you stop accepting fake loyalty, once you stop chasing conditional love, once you stop begging for applause, you don't feel alone anymore. You feel free, and freedom. Freedom is where real power begins. You started questioning yourself instead of them. It didn't happen all at once. That's the most dangerous part. No explosion, no obvious betrayal, just a slow, methodical erosion of certainty. They didn't attack you directly. They questioned you politely. Are you sure that's what happened? Maybe you're remembering it wrong. I think you're taking this too personally. And at first, you shrugged it off because you trusted them. Because doubt feels harmless when it wears a calm voice. But doubt is never harmless. It's a seed, and they planted it carefully. Every time your instinct screamed, they whispered. Every time your gut warned you, they dismissed it. Every time you stood firm, they tilted the ground beneath your feet. You knew what you felt, you knew what you saw, you knew what hurt, but slowly you stopped trusting that knowing. You began replaying conversations in your head, rewinding moments, freezing frames. Did I overreact? Did I misread that? Was it really that bad? That's how gaslighting works. It doesn't tell you you're wrong. It convinces you that you might be. And once that door opens, they walk in freely. Your instincts, once sharp, once fast, started hesitating. That pause became dangerous. You used to feel something immediately, a tension, a warning, a pull in your chest. Now you second-guessed it. You told yourself to be rational, to be calm, to be fair, but fairness became self-betrayal. You gave everyone else the benefit of the doubt and gave yourself none. They made mistakes. You made excuses for them. You felt pain. You interrogated yourself for feeling it. You noticed patterns. You accused yourself of paranoia. And the more you questioned yourself, the more confident they became. Because people who control the narrative fear one thing above all else, your clarity. So they blurred it. They didn't need to overpower you. They just needed you unsure. And it worked. You started shrinking your reactions, softening your words, diluting your truth. You adjusted yourself to keep the peace. You edited your emotions to stay acceptable. You muted your instincts to stay included. And somewhere in that process, you lost yourself, not dramatically, not suddenly, quietly. You stopped recognizing your own voice. Your thoughts sounded foreign. Your opinions felt negotiable. You became flexible, adaptable, agreeable, and exhausted. Because it takes an enormous amount of energy to constantly doubt your own perception, to wake up every day wondering if your feelings are valid, to carry pain and then question whether you're allowed to feel it, to sense something is wrong and then convince yourself you're imagining it. That internal war never stops. It just gets quieter. You argued with yourself more than you argued with them. You corrected yourself before anyone else could. You punished yourself to avoid being punished by others. That's when they knew they had you, because once you start policing your own instincts, they don't have to. You did their work for them. You questioned your memory, your judgment, your worth. You told yourself you were difficult, too emotional, too intense, too much, and in trying to become easier to deal with, you became harder to recognize. Look at yourself now. Look at the hesitation, the second guessing, the way you paused before speaking. That didn't come from weakness. That came from survival. But survival has a cost. You traded instinct for approval, certainty for acceptance, identity for peace, and peace never came, because peace built on self-doubt is fragile. It shatters the moment you're alone with your thoughts. That was the breaking point. Not when they hurt you, not when they dismissed you, but when you realized you no longer trusted yourself. That realization hit like ice, because you understood something terrifying. They hadn't taken your power. You had handed it over one doubt at a time. And the moment you saw that, something shifted. Not confidence, not rage, awareness. You remembered who you were before the confusion, before the constant questioning, before the endless self-correction. You remembered the version of you that didn't need permission to feel, that didn't need validation to know, that didn't negotiate with their instincts. And in that memory, there was anger, cold, focused, quiet, because nothing enrages a mind like realizing it was manipulated into doubting itself. That was the fracture. The crack where the old version of you began to die. And from that crack, something else started forming. Not the person they wanted, not the version they could control, but the one who would never question their own truth again. And once that version wakes up, there is no going back. You tried explaining one last time. There comes a moment when silence becomes unbearable. Not because you have nothing left to say, but because you have everything left to say. This was that moment. You told yourself this time would be different, that if you just chose the right words, the calm ones, the careful ones, the ones stripped of anger and sharpened with patience, they would finally understand. So you opened your mouth one last time, not to accuse, not to attack, not to demand, but to explain. You didn't raise your voice. You didn't point fingers. You didn't bring weapons, only truth. You softened your tone like a peace offering. You carried your pain gently, as if it might break if handled too roughly. You weren't asking to win. You weren't asking to dominate. You were asking to be seen. Every sentence was measured. Every word filtered through restraint. You didn't say, "You hurt me." You said, "I feel hurt." You didn't say, "You betrayed me." You said, "Something changed." You turned your wounds into metaphors, your anger into diplomacy, your desperation into reason. Because somewhere inside you still believed that honesty could save this. That belief cost you everything. You weren't begging with words, you were begging with posture, with pauses, with the way your voice broke and then steadied itself again. You were saying, "Please don't make me harden. Please don't force me to choose myself over you. Please don't let this be the moment I stop caring." And they heard you. That's the cruelest part. They heard every word. They just didn't hear it the way you meant it. They heard opportunity. They watched you expose your chest and called it conversation. They watched you lower your guard and called it weakness. Your vulnerability became a map. Your honesty became leverage. They didn't meet you with clarity. They met you with confusion. They didn't answer questions. They deflected them. They didn't acknowledge pain. They reframed it. Suddenly, the conversation wasn't about what they did. It was about how you reacted. Not about the wound, but about your tone. Not about the truth, but about timing. They spoke in circles. They twisted language until nothing had an edge anymore. "I never said that. That's not what I meant. You're misunderstanding. You're too sensitive. You're reading into it." And with every sentence, they pushed the focus away from themselves. You could feel it happening. That sinking realization, that familiar tightening in your chest. This wasn't resolution. This was control. They weren't listening to understand. They were listening to respond, to redirect, to dominate the narrative. You slowed down, you tried again, you explained it differently, simpler, clearer. You used examples, you used timelines, you used logic, still nothing. They nodded without absorbing, they spoke without meaning, they promised without intention. Their silence was calculated, their words were strategic, and that's when it hit you. This conversation was never meant to heal. It was meant to exhaust you, to drain your energy, to make you question your delivery instead of their damage, to leave you feeling guilty for even speaking. You felt smaller with every sentence, not because your truth shrank, but because it was being ignored. You watched your final emotional appeal dissolve in real time, and something inside you snapped, not loudly, not dramatically, but permanently, because you realized this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a refusal. They didn't want to understand you. They wanted you compliant. They didn't want honesty. They wanted silence that benefited them. And suddenly your effort felt foolish. All that patience, all that restraint, all that emotional labor wasted on people who thrived on your confusion. That was the moment you stopped explaining, not out of spite, not out of pride, but out of clarity. Because explaining yourself to someone committed to misunderstanding you is a form of self-harm. You saw it then. Your words weren't bridges. They were offerings thrown into a void. And the void didn't echo back. It absorbed. It erased. It consumed. So you went quiet, not the defeated kind of quiet, not the broken kind, but the kind that comes before a storm. The kind that says, "I see you now." Your silence wasn't surrender, it was withdrawal. You took your truth back, you took your energy back, you took your voice and locked it away from those who never deserved to hear it. They thought they won. They mistook your stillness for weakness, your distance for guilt, your restraint for fear. They didn't realize they had just witnessed the last moment they ever had access to you. Because the person who explains endlessly is still hoping, still attached, still open. But the person who goes silent has decided. And once that decision is made, there are no more negotiations. No more appeals, no more explanations, only consequence, and they won't hear it coming. That night you realized something was wrong. It didn't happen in the middle of chaos. It didn't arrive with shouting or tears or broken things. It came quietly, one ordinary night, no dramatic ending, no final argument, just stillness. You were alone with your thoughts, and for the first time in a long time they weren't loud. No anger pounding in your chest, no sadness clawing at your throat, no urge to defend yourself in conversations that weren't happening, just silence. And that's when you noticed it. You didn't feel anymore. Not numb like panic, not numb like shock, but numb like completion, the kind of emptiness that comes after something has already died. You searched yourself for rage. It wasn't there. You reached for pain. Nothing answered. You even tried to summon forgiveness, that familiar reflex you were trained to use, but even that felt unnecessary. That scared you more than anger ever could, because anger means you still care. Pain means you're still invested. Forgiveness means you're still trying to save something. But this was different. This was clarity. You realized you weren't calm because things were okay. You were calm because you were done. Not in a dramatic, vengeful way. Not with threats or ultimatums. Done in the quiet, irreversible sense. Like closing a book you'll never open again. You replayed everything. The conversations, the apologies that led nowhere, the effort that only went one direction, and for the first time the pattern revealed itself without distortion. No excuses, no emotional fog, just truth. You saw how often you shrank to keep the peace, how often you doubted yourself to protect their comfort, how often you accepted confusion instead of demanding respect. And instead of feeling anger toward them, you felt disappointment in yourself. Not harsh, not cruel, just honest. You realized how much energy you had spent trying to be understood by people who benefited from misunderstanding you. That realization landed heavy, but it didn't crush you, it steadied you. You understood something fundamental in that moment. You weren't losing them. You were losing the illusion of them. The version you kept alive in your head, the version that might change, the version that might finally see you. And letting go of that illusion didn't hurt the way you expected. It felt clean, no inner debate, no guilt spiral, just a quiet decision forming beneath the surface. You stopped asking, why did they do this? And started asking, why did I allow it? That shift changed everything. You realized your silence wasn't weakness. It was alignment. Your body already knew what your mind was catching up to. That's why there was no anger. Anger is what comes when boundaries are violated, but you had already rebuilt them. Inwardly, silently, they just didn't know yet. You sat there, breathing evenly, realizing this was the moment. The real one, not the argument, not the confrontation, not the dramatic goodbye. This quiet acceptance, this emotional stillness. This point where you no longer needed closure because understanding had replaced it. You weren't broken, you were resolved, and that scared you in a strange way because you knew what came next. When anger fades, people expect reconciliation. When pain fades, they expect forgiveness. But when clarity arrives, there is no return. You don't explain clarity. You don't negotiate with clarity. You move, slowly, deliberately, without announcement. That night, nothing changed on the outside. But everything changed within you. The need to be heard vanished. The urge to prove yourself evaporated. The desire to fix what was never yours to fix disappeared. You didn't feel powerful. You felt certain. And certainty is far more dangerous because certainty doesn't seek approval. It doesn't look back. It doesn't ask permission. It simply acts. That night, you didn't make promises. You didn't plan revenge. You just accepted the truth. And acceptance, real acceptance, is the point of no return. They would notice eventually. The distance, the shift, the way your presence no longer reached for them. But by then, it wouldn't matter. Because the moment you realized something was wrong was the moment you stopped trying to make it right. They mistook your patience for permission. They thought my silence was weakness. They thought my calm was complacency. They thought patience meant permission. They were wrong. It began subtly. A word here, a boundary ignored there. At first, I let it slide, because patience isn't passive. Patience is strategy. Patience is armor. Patience is the eye of the storm while the world rages around you. But they didn't see that. They never saw anything but what they wanted to see. And so the small disrespect became larger. The quiet dismissal became habitual. The casual disregard turned into expectation. Every insult unreturned, every slight unanswered, every manipulation left unchallenged. They thought they owned it. They thought they owned me. They didn't notice. I was counting every misstep, every betrayal, every act of thoughtless cruelty. The first time I warned silently, not in words, not in shouts, just in the firmness of my posture, in the coldness of my stare. I let them feel the weight of what they had done. But they laughed. They tested again and again, over and over. They never realized that every time they crossed the line, I didn't forget. Every action was logged in the ledger of my mind. Every word, every gesture, every attempt to push me past my limits, every moment of disrespect fed a fire they could not see. And that is the thing about patience. It is not the absence of action. It is preparation. It is calculation. It is the slow, deliberate building of a force they can never anticipate. I watched them escalate, thinking I would break first, thinking that my restraint was surrender. But restraint is power waiting to be claimed, and I never surrender. The pattern became. They tested boundaries until the boundaries didn't just bend, they became walls. They ignored my warnings until the warnings transformed into decisions. Every repetition strengthened my resolve, and then the silence began. Not just ordinary silence, the kind that carries weight, the kind that speaks louder than any shout, the kind that makes a person reconsider every move they have ever made. This silence was a countdown, a slow, measured beat, marking the time before the reckoning, and they didn't hear it. Because they never wanted to, they saw patience and assumed weakness. They saw tolerance and assumed approval. They saw restraint and assumed fear. They were wrong. Every act of disrespect, every slight, every test, they were building their own undoing, and I was the architect, the silent observer, the unseen hand guiding the inevitable. I had grown tired of just watching, tired of giving second chances, tired of letting my kindness be mistaken for foolishness. Tired of letting the world think that my forgiveness was weakness, so I waited. And with every passing day, the quiet became louder, the patience became sharper, the restraint became lethal, because patience without principle is nothing. Patience without boundaries is surrender. Patience without awareness is disaster. But my patience was the slow drawing of a blade, the tightening of a noose, the assembling of every moment they had ever underestimated me, and they never saw it coming. They never knew it was building. They never realized the quiet ones are always the most dangerous, because the quiet mind is calculating, the silent heart is unbreakable, the restrained spirit is unstoppable. Let them test you, let them push, let them try to break you. Every time they do, you grow stronger. Every time they assume permission, you collect power. Every time they mistake your patience for weakness, you prepare your rise. And when the moment comes, it will not be sudden. It will not be chaotic. It will not be accidental. It will be precise, deliberate, absolute. The moment of revelation will hit them harder than anything they could imagine. Every manipulation, every mockery, every attempt to control you, it will come back to them tenfold, and they will realize too late. They will realize that patience was never permission, that tolerance was never weakness, that restraint was never surrender. It was preparation, it was strategy. It was the slow, inevitable building of a storm they never saw coming. They thought they were the predators, but I was always the apex, always the force they could not reckon with, always the silent shadow behind every action they took. And when I act, it will be devastating. Every slight they ever threw in my path will become a mirror reflecting their own failure. Every doubt they planted in me will turn into a fortress of my certainty. Every disrespect will fuel the fire of my supremacy. This is the nature of patience misunderstood. This is the nature of restraint ignored. This is the nature of a warrior underestimated. They will look at the aftermath and ask how it happened. They will search for the moment they missed. They will blame luck. They will blame circumstance. They will blame anyone but themselves. And I will smile because I know I always knew. Patience is not the absence of strength. Patience is the promise of it. And I always keep my promises. So let them test. Let them push. Let them escalate, because every time they do, they write their own demise. Every time they assume permission, they carve their own path to ruin. Every time they mistake patience for weakness, they forge the chains that will bind them. And when I finally move, when my silence breaks and my voice is heard, when the restrained fury becomes unstoppable, they will see the truth. Not too late, but finally. Patience was never permission. Patience was power. Patience was the shadow before the storm. Patience was the sword waiting to strike, and I am that sword, sharp, unyielding, unforgiving. Let them feel the consequences of underestimating me. Let them face the reality that my patience was not weakness. It was inevitability, and when they fall, they will understand. Too late, of course, but they will understand, because the quiet ones do not stay quiet forever, and the patient ones do not remain ignored. They mistook my patience for permission. I mistook their ignorance for something I could ignore, and now the reckoning begins. You did announce it. You simply stopped. There was no farewell, no dramatic exit, no final message wrapped in closure and courtesy, no announcement to soften the impact. You didn't explain, you didn't justify, you didn't warn, you simply stopped. And that silence confused them more than any confrontation ever could, because they were trained to expect reactions: anger, sadness, questions, forgiveness. They were prepared for noise. They were not prepared for absence. You didn't disappear in the way cowards do. You didn't vanish out of fear or weakness. You withdrew. There's a difference. Disappearing is running. Withdrawing is reclaiming. You didn't leave because you were broken. You left because you were done bleeding for an audience that applauded your pain. You stopped reaching out, stopped checking in, stopped explaining yourself into exhaustion, not to punish them, not to make a point, but because your energy was no longer available for misuse. You didn't announce growth, you embodied it. You didn't say, "I need space." You took it. You didn't demand respect. You removed access, and that terrified them, because suddenly there was no feedback loop, no emotional supply, no reaction to feed on. They said something provocative and nothing came back. They tested the waters, silence. They waited for you to correct them, chase them, reassure them, nothing. And that's when they felt it. Not anger, not hatred, loss of control. Your sudden emotional absence wasn't loud. It didn't scream, it echoed. It forced them to sit alone with themselves, with their words hanging unanswered, with their actions finally unsupported. You didn't give them closure because closure was never yours to provide. You had already closed the door inside yourself. Your withdrawal wasn't coldness, it was precision. You chose where your warmth would no longer go. You didn't say, "You hurt me." You didn't say, "I deserve better." You let your absence say everything. Because silence, when intentional, is not empty. It is loaded. Every unanswered message carried weight. Every ignored provocation became a mirror. Every moment they expected you and didn't find you, that was the message. You weren't trying to be missed. You were done being available. You didn't disappear. You withdrew. You stepped back far enough to see clearly, to observe patterns without emotion clouding your vision. To watch who panicked without your presence, to see who only noticed you when you were gone, and what you saw confirmed everything. Some reached out not with concern but confusion, not with accountability but entitlement. They didn't ask, "Are you okay?" They asked, "Why aren't you responding?" That told you everything you needed to know. Your silence was not a cry for attention. It was a declaration of independence. You reclaimed your time, your energy, your emotional bandwidth. You stopped volunteering yourself to be misunderstood. And in that stillness, something awakened. Not rage, not vengeance, authority. You realized how powerful you are when you stop explaining yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you. How untouchable you become when you no longer need to be seen. You watched from a distance as they struggled to adjust to a version of reality where you were no longer available on demand. And you felt no guilt, because guilt is for people who did something wrong. You didn't abandon anyone. You simply stopped abandoning yourself. Your withdrawal was not passive. It was an act of self-command. You chose silence not because you had nothing to say, but because you had finally said enough. I didn't disappear, I withdrew. That sentence became your internal oath, a reminder that power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it leaves quietly and lets the world figure out what it lost. You didn't burn bridges. You walked away while they were still standing on them, wondering why the structure felt unstable. You didn't need the last word, because you were done speaking to people who never listened. And the most dangerous part, you felt peace. Not relief, not numbness, peace. The kind that comes when you are no longer at war with yourself. Your silence wasn't weakness. It was the sound of you choosing yourself without apology, without explanation, without permission. And from that moment on, everything changed. Because the one who withdraws with clarity is no longer available for manipulation. And anyone who loses access to you must finally face themselves. That was never your responsibility. That was simply the consequence. You didn't announce it. You simply stopped. And in doing so, you took your power back. Silence as a shield. Silence is not weakness. It is not surrender. It is not absence. Silence is armor. Silent, impenetrable, unapologetic armor. For years, your words were currency. Your feelings were weapons. Your honesty was ammunition for those who thrived on your energy. They demanded it all. They drained it all. And when nothing was left, they found new ways to take. But now you speak with your presence. You act with restraint. You protect what is yours. Silence becomes your shield. Every word you no longer offer is a victory. Every reaction withheld is a boundary enforced. Every pause, every unspoken sentence, every calm breath, a fortress rising around you. You have learned that chaos feeds on voice, on explanation, on begging to be understood, so you stop, not out of fear, not out of weakness, but because you recognize the cost and you refuse to pay it. Silence protects your energy. It protects your mind. It protects your peace. No more lakes. No more bleeding for those who would never notice. No more exhaustion spent appeasing shadows. Calm replaces chaos. Stillness replaces noise. The storm you once carried in every argument, every confrontation, every attempt to reason with the unreasonable dissolves into nothingness. And in that stillness, power awakens, because silence is not empty. It is intentional. It is strategic. It is lethal in its own way. Those who once sought to provoke you, to drain you, to manipulate you now face a force they cannot read, a presence they cannot predict, a strength they cannot measure. Your calm is a battlefield. Your quiet is a declaration. Your withdrawal of energy, a warning to all who dare to exploit your compassion. You no longer react. You no longer explain. You no longer apologize. Silence does not need justification. It does not answer to expectation. It does not negotiate with entitlement. And the paradox is exquisite. The more silent you become, the louder your power speaks. Every withheld comment, every unshared truth, every ignored slight echoes louder than any argument you could ever have had. They think your silence is absence. They think it is surrender. They think it is emptiness. They are wrong. Silence is not the void. Silence is the shield, the barrier that keeps your soul intact, the armor that makes your heart untouchable, the weapon that turns the hunter into the untouchable. And in that stillness, clarity reigns. Your mind, once fractured by their demands, is whole. Your energy, once dispersed by their games, is yours again. Your calm, once foreign, is now familiar. You do not need to fight every battle. You do not need to justify every feeling. You do not need to bend to their expectations, because silence itself is an answer, a proclamation, a fortress that no one can breach, and with it you rise unshaken, unmoved, unassailable. Let them speak, let them demand, let them provoke. Your silence is your shield, and behind it you are unstoppable. You will no longer sacrifice yourself for validation. You will no longer expend energy for the unworthy. You will no longer bleed for those who profit from your wounds, because silence protects, silence strengthens, silence frees, and in that freedom you are untouchable, you are whole, you are powerful, you are invincible. Let them try to break it, let them try to understand it. They will fail, because silence is not absence. Silence is dominance, silence is control, silence is victory. And now you are armored, you are calm, you are unstoppable. They felt the shift before they understood it. They felt it before they could name it, before they could explain it, before they could pretend it wasn't happening. They felt the shift. Something changed in the air around you, in the way you moved, in the way you listened without reacting, in the way you no longer reached for them the way you used to. At first, they couldn't tell what it was. They just knew something was off. You were still there, still present, still breathing in the same rooms, but you were no longer available. And that unsettled them, because they were used to access, used to your attention being one call away, one message away, one emotional trigger away. They were used to pulling a string and watching you respond. But now, the string was gone. They spoke, expecting resistance. They got calm. They tested boundaries, expecting compromise. They got silence. They provoked, expecting emotion. They got nothing. And that's when confusion crept in. Not concern, not empathy, confusion. Because they could no longer read you, you stopped oversharing, stopped explaining, stopped filling the silence for their comfort. You no longer rushed to correct misunderstandings. You no longer chased clarity for people who thrived on distortion. You let things sit, and that terrified them. Because when someone loses access to you, they don't feel your absence first. They feel their loss of control. They notice the delay in your responses, the brevity of your words. The way you no longer lingered in conversations that went nowhere. They noticed you stopped asking for permission to be yourself, and they didn't like it. They asked questions disguised as jokes, concern disguised as curiosity, subtle probes meant to reopen doors you had already closed. Are you okay? You seem different. You've changed. Yes, you have, but you didn't announce it. You didn't explain it. You didn't soften it. You let them feel it, and that feeling made them uneasy. Because for the first time, they weren't the center of your emotional gravity. You didn't orbit them anymore. You had your own axis now, and the loss of access exposed everything. They realized they couldn't reach you the same way, couldn't influence you with guilt, couldn't pull reactions out of you with chaos. Their old methods stopped working, and cracks began to form. Small ones at first, moments where they stumbled over their words, moments where they over-explained themselves. Moments where they tried too hard to get a response, because when manipulation stops working, desperation follows. They sensed your detachment before they understood its meaning. They felt the distance before they could admit it was permanent. Your calm made them restless. Your silence made them loud. Your boundaries made them uncomfortable, because your stillness forced movement in them. They started replaying past interactions, revisiting old arguments, wondering when exactly they lost their grip. Was it when you stopped defending yourself? Was it when you stopped reacting? Was it when you stopped caring how they perceived you? They didn't know. They just knew something was gone, and that loss echoed. You saw it in their behavior, the sudden friendliness, the awkward compliments, the subtle attempts to reinsert themselves into your world. They didn't want connection. They wanted access restored. But you didn't move. You didn't flinch. You didn't step back into the role they assigned you. Because you were no longer playing, and the first real cracks appeared, not in you, but in them. They grew impatient, irritable, uneasy. They tried to provoke the old version of you, the one who would explain, the one who would react, the one who would stay. But that version no longer existed. You had outgrown it quietly, and nothing is more unsettling than realizing the person you once controlled now controls themselves. They felt it in conversations that ended too quickly, in boundaries that didn't bend. In the absence of emotional labor you used to provide, they felt it when you stopped absorbing their chaos. They felt it when their words no longer landed, and slowly the truth began to surface. You were no longer accessible on their terms. You were no longer predictable. You were no longer theirs. That realization didn't arrive gently. It cracked. It fractured their sense of certainty, because the shift wasn't about them losing you. It was about you reclaiming yourself. And once that happens, nothing ever goes back to the way it was. They felt it before they understood it. And by the time they did, it was already too late, because you had moved beyond reaction, beyond explanation, beyond permission. You weren't fighting anymore. You were finished. And the most dangerous part, you didn't need them to understand. You only needed them to feel it. The shift, the distance, the end of access. And as the cracks widened, you stood untouched, calm, grounded, unreachable. Because the moment someone feels your power before they understand it, you've already won. You started watching instead of reacting. There was a moment, quiet, almost invisible, when you stopped reacting. Not because you were tired, not because you gave up, but because you finally woke up. You realized something dangerous. Every reaction was a donation, every outburst a payment, every explanation a currency they spent freely. So you stopped paying, you started watching. And in that stillness, everything changed. You saw how predictable it all was. The timing, the patterns, the recycled tactics dressed up as new behavior. You saw how chaos was never accidental, how drama was deployed like a weapon, how kindness appeared only when control was slipping. You noticed the rhythm, trigger, reaction, apology, repeat. And once you saw the loop, you stepped out of it. You stopped interrupting their stories, stopped correcting lies. Stop defending your truth to people invested in misunderstanding it. You listened, not with hope, with clarity, and clarity is ruthless. You noticed how they only listened when they needed something, how concern arrived on schedule, how silence was used as punishment. You noticed how praise came with strings, how affection came with conditions, how respect disappeared the moment you set boundaries. And you didn't flinch, you didn't argue, you observed. You watched how their tone changed when you didn't respond fast enough, how frustration crept into their voice when their usual tricks stopped working. You watched them circle back to old tactics like a broken machine repeating familiar moves. Guilt, fear, flattery, anger, same script, different day. And for the first time, you weren't inside the storm. You were above it. You saw masks begin to slip, not all at once, not dramatically, in flashes, a smile that arrived too late. A kindness that felt rehearsed, an apology with no accountability attached. You noticed the cracks, the impatience behind the calm, the insecurity behind the dominance, the fear behind the need to control. You saw how their power depended on your participation, and you withdrew it. You stopped explaining your silence, stopped justifying your distance, stopped narrating your healing for spectators who never wanted you whole. You let them reveal themselves. Because when you stop reacting, people show you who they really are. You saw who respected your boundaries and who only tolerated them until it became inconvenient. You saw who listened and who only waited for their turn to speak. You saw who cared about your growth and who felt threatened by it. And you kept watching. You didn't rush to label. You didn't confront immediately. You gathered data, every interruption, every deflection, every time they ignored your discomfort and called it a misunderstanding. You stopped taking notes emotionally and started taking notes strategically, because awareness is power, and you were finally armed. You noticed how silence made them nervous, how your calm unsettled them more than anger ever did. You noticed how they filled the quiet with noise, desperate to provoke something, anything, a reaction, a crack, a sign you still belonged to the old version of yourself, but you didn't give it to them. You stayed still, and stillness became your shield. You saw patterns you could never see while bleeding. You saw how they created problems only to position themselves as the solution. You saw how they dismissed your pain but demanded empathy for theirs. You saw how accountability vanished the moment responsibility knocked, and you didn't need to expose them. They were exposing themselves, because when you stop reacting, the performance collapses. They grew uncomfortable around you, not because you were cold, but because you were clear. They couldn't read you anymore. Couldn't predict you, couldn't control the narrative, and that terrified them. You noticed how they tested limits, small pushes, subtle jabs, passive-aggressive remarks disguised as humor. You watched each one, and you let it land in silence. No defense, no counterattack, just observation. And in that space, truth screamed. You realized how much energy you used to waste trying to be understood by people who benefited from misunderstanding you. You realized how many battles you fought that were never meant to be won, only prolonged. So you stopped fighting, and in doing so, you became untouchable. You watched how they reacted to your growth. Some admired it quietly, some resented it loudly, some tried to pull you back with nostalgia and guilt. Remember when you were different? Yes, you thought. I remember when I was smaller. You watched how discomfort revealed character. You watched who adjusted and who resisted, and you made your decisions in silence. Because power doesn't announce itself. Power observes, power waits, power chooses its moment. You learned that not every truth needs to be spoken. Not every betrayal needs a confrontation. Not every ending needs closure. Some endings need distance. Some truths need silence. Some victories need patience. And you mastered all three. You stopped explaining your evolution. Stopped asking permission to outgrow spaces that suffocated you. You let people feel the absence of the version of you they could manipulate. And that absence spoke louder than any argument. You saw how they tried to rewrite history once they realized you remembered it clearly. You saw how they questioned your memory because they couldn't control it anymore. You didn't argue, you knew, and knowing was enough. Because once you start watching instead of reacting, you stop being a target. You become a mirror. And most people can't stand what they see when no one distracts them from themselves. You didn't harden, you sharpened. You didn't close your heart, you guarded it. You didn't become cold, you became precise. And precision is dangerous. You saw the game, you learned the rules, and then you stopped playing. You understood something final. Reaction is instinct. Observation is evolution, and you chose evolution. You watched, you learned, you rose. And by the time they realized you were no longer reacting, you were already gone. Silence. I didn't just stop speaking, I stopped giving them fuel. I stopped handing them pieces of me to manipulate, to twist, to use. And in that absence, something remarkable happened. They saw themselves. At first, it was subtle, a pause too long, a question left unanswered, a reaction they expected never coming. Confusion flickered across their faces, a twitch of frustration, the tiniest crack in their composure. They had relied on my voice to define the rhythm of their day, to validate their narratives, to absorb their chaos and carry it like a cloak. And I pulled the cloak away. Silence became my mirror, but it reflected them, not me. For the first time, they confronted themselves, their own insecurities, their own manipulations, their own cowardice. No one likes looking at themselves, especially not when the reflection shows the truth they spend years hiding, the truth they package as humor, as concern, as obligation. Suddenly, they were uncomfortable because the silence wasn't empty. It was charged. It held accountability without a word. And they began to squirm. Projection rose like a tide. They called my withdrawal cruelty. They labeled my calm indifference. They blamed me for the tension I refused to supply. But they were wrong. I wasn't causing anything. I wasn't reacting. I was only watching. And in watching, I understood the discomfort they felt wasn't about me. It was about themselves, their lies, their choices, their inability to face what they've done. And suddenly, my silence wasn't just absence. It became a weapon. Not of attack, but of revelation. They projected their guilt, their fear, their anger. They tried to fill the space I left with noise, with excuses, with blame. But the mirror never lies, and they hated it. They hated being forced to confront the parts of themselves they had carefully hidden behind charm, aggression, or manipulation. They hated being stripped of the power I had unknowingly given them, and they didn't know how to respond, because silence can't be argued with. Silence doesn't justify. Silence doesn't bow. Silence reflects. It forces accountability. It forces clarity. It forces the truth out of hiding, and they floundered. They tried everything they always tried: provocation, persuasion, pity, guilt, but nothing worked. Every tactic bounced off the shield I had constructed without a word. They were left with themselves. For some, the reflection was unbearable. They saw the selfishness they disguised as concern, the arrogance they covered with smiles, the cruelty they wrapped in advice. And in that discomfort, they faltered. They tried to pull me back into their narrative. They tested boundaries. They whispered, begged, cajoled, shouted. They demanded explanation. They sought reaction, but I remained still, because the mirror doesn't need commentary. The mirror doesn't beg for understanding. The mirror simply is, and in being it exposes. I watched them wrestle with the reflection I offered, without guilt, without anger, without participation. I watched them confront the patterns they had refused to see, the toxicity they had cloaked in smiles, the selfishness they had justified as survival, and I realized something vital. My silence didn't isolate me. It liberated me. It freed my energy. It strengthened my clarity. It sharpened my perception. But more importantly, it forced them to face the consequences of their actions. The discomfort grew. It spread like wildfire. The projection became desperate. They accused. They twisted. They tried to pin their fear, their shame, their failure on me. But I didn't move. I didn't react. I didn't bend, because I wasn't the enemy. I was the mirror. And mirrors cannot be shattered by lies. They only reflect what is already there. And in that reflection, the truth is unbearable. The truth doesn't plead. The truth doesn't negotiate. The truth stands, and they were forced to confront it. Some walked away, unable to endure the honesty I refused to supply. Some lingered, hoping I would falter, hoping I would break the silence they could not bear. Some, the rare few, began to see themselves, to reckon with the patterns they had ignored, to acknowledge the shadow they had cast upon everyone else. And I realized silence is not the absence of power. Silence is the most potent form of control, because it makes them accountable, whether they want it or not. It transforms the dynamic. It rewrites the narrative. It flips the script without uttering a single word. And in that shift, I gained what I had always been denied: clarity, peace, strength. My silence became a statement, a boundary, a declaration, and the mirror reflected back not only their truths but my own growth, my own control, my own unshakable resolve. They could project all they wanted, they could fabricate all they needed, but the mirror doesn't lie, and it never will, because now the silence is mine, the reflection is theirs, and the balance of power is finally clear. I stopped reacting. Not out of fear, not out of weakness, but because I finally saw. I saw the patterns, the cycles, the masks slipping. The same faces, the same words, the same manipulations repeated like a cruel melody they thought I'd dance to. Every insult, every slight, every bait, they all had rhythm. And I had been dancing to it for far too long. But not anymore. I became the observer, the silent witness. I started watching instead of reacting. At first, it felt strange, almost unnatural. To withhold the fire I once spat so freely, to swallow the rage and let it sit, a calm inferno, beneath my skin. But slowly the patterns revealed themselves, the repetition, the manipulation, the endless hunger of those who fed on my reactions. I realized they were predictable, all of them. No matter how clever, no matter how charming, no matter how convincing, they all moved according to the same formula. And I stopped feeding it. They grew restless. Frustration flickered in their eyes. Confusion crept into their tone. They leaned in, expecting a reaction, and found nothing. And in that nothing, I found clarity. I wasn't powerless. I wasn't weak. I was free. I watched them claw at the air, desperate for the spark I refused to provide. I watched the masks slip, the polite smiles turning tight, the feigned concern cracking at the edges. And I smiled quietly to myself, because in silence there is power. In restraint there is revelation. And then it happened. I realized something they would never see coming. My silence wasn't absence. It wasn't submission. It was armor. A shield forged in the fires of betrayal, in the crucible of manipulation. A calm fortress no words could penetrate, no guilt could breach, no anger could erode. And they noticed. The confusion spread. They tried to push harder, to provoke, to manipulate, to bend me back to their rhythm. But the rhythm had died, and they didn't know how to create a new one. And then silence became more than armor. It became a mirror. They were confronted by their own behavior, their cruelty, their selfishness, their manipulations, all reflected back, clear and undeniable, and they hated it. They projected, they blamed, they shouted. They tried to fill the space I had carved out with excuses, justifications, false concern. But the mirror doesn't lie. It doesn't negotiate. It doesn't waver. It only reflects. They floundered. They twisted. They tried to pin the chaos on me. But I didn't move, I didn't react, I didn't bend, I simply stood still, and they saw themselves. Some were terrified, some were enraged, some were forced to finally confront the parts of themselves they had hidden from the world and even from themselves. Because mirrors are unforgiving, and silence gives no answers. It doesn't soothe, it doesn't apologize, it only forces reflection. I watched them unravel quietly. Every accusation they threw, every attempt to draw me back in, every desperate plea for control bounced off the armor I had built. I was untouchable, not because I was stronger than them, but because I was finally free from their expectations. And as I watched, I realized the mirror was not just for them. It was for me. I saw the strength I had cultivated, the clarity I had earned, the calm that replaced the chaos I once allowed into my life. I understood that silence is not submission. It is a declaration, a boundary, a statement that I am no longer your puppet, your target, your tool. I saw the fear in their eyes, not because they feared me, but because they feared the truth that they could no longer control me, the truth that their lies and manipulations would not reach their destination. And that fear was delicious, not because I wished harm, but because it meant the scales were finally tipping, because I had become the observer, the mirror, the one untouchable in their chaos. I had become the calm eye in their storm. I had become the force they could not predict, could not provoke, could not corrupt. And in that silence, I found my own reflection. I saw resilience. I saw clarity. I saw the parts of myself they had tried to erase. And they saw it too. Flickers of recognition, glimmers of fear, the cracks forming where their control once stood. I realized then my silence didn't just protect me, it exposed them, their weakness. Their dependency on my reaction to validate their existence. They were naked, stripped of their power, forced to reckon with what they had become. And I was untouchable. I watched the desperation grow. The projections, the accusations, the attempts to reclaim what they lost, all futile, because I had stepped outside their rhythm. I had refused the dance, and in refusing, I became more than they could ever imagine. Silence is not emptiness. Silence is strength. Silence is truth. And in that truth, I stand unshaken. The masks fall, the projections crumble, the lies evaporate. All that remains is clarity. All that remains is power. All that remains is me, watching, learning, knowing. And in that quiet, in that stillness, I discovered a force they could never understand, the power of being untouchable, of being unprovoked, of being the mirror they cannot escape. And when they finally understood, it was too late. The shift had already happened. The balance had already changed. The game had already ended because I had stopped reacting, and in stopping, I had begun. The first ripples began quietly, not a roar, not a clash, a whisper, a hesitation, a flicker in the air where once there had been only certainty. They noticed. It started small. A glance lingered too long. A word stumbled. A plan faltered. They weren't used to me not reacting. They weren't used to me being untouchable. They weren't used to the truth staring back at them, and the ripples spread. I watched it fascinated, like a predator observing the subtle tremor of prey. Every misstep they made, every pause, every flicker of doubt, it all told me a story I had known all along, a story they were only now beginning to see, because the world I had inhabited, the one they had thought I belonged to, was shifting. The rules were changing. The game had new boundaries, and I was the one drawing them. At first, they resisted, fiercely, desperately. They tried to reclaim their control, to provoke, to manipulate, to bend me back to the rhythm they understood. But it was gone. I had stepped outside their patterns, outside their expectations, outside the cycle that fed their egos and left me exhausted, empty, bleeding in silence. And now I watch the cracks grow. The first ripple is subtle. It is a hesitation, a question, a doubt. And from that hesitation comes possibility, a seed of fear, a seed of recognition, a seed that I had planted simply by not being what they wanted me to be. They felt it, even if they didn't name it, didn't acknowledge it. They felt the shift, and their unease was delicious, not because I wished harm, but because it meant the scales were finally tipping. The first ripple is also an awakening. I realized then that my silence, my observation, my restraint, they were not passive. They were active. They were transformative. They were the force that could change the entire dynamic, quietly, irrevocably. And the ripples began to interact. One hesitation led to another. One crack exposed another. Patterns I had recognized before, the manipulations, the gaslighting, the ego-driven games, began to collapse under their own weight. And I didn't lift a finger. I didn't speak a word. I simply existed as the constant, untouchable force that refused to play by their rules. The ripple becomes a wave when the tension reaches the surface. I saw it in the small things, a raised eyebrow where once there was confidence, a pause mid-insult where once they struck without thought, a subtle shift in tone where once their words were sharp, precise, unyielding. They were beginning to recognize their own fragility, the very fragility they had tried to exploit in me, and the realization spread, slowly, painfully, inevitably. The ripples became awareness. The awareness became discomfort. The discomfort became fear. because they knew deep down that I had changed, and that their power over me had ended. The first ripple is also a reflection. Every glance they cast my way, every attempt to provoke, every feigned smile hiding their frustration, it all reflected back their own weaknesses, their impatience, their selfishness, their reliance on my reaction to validate their existence. And the ripples reminded them of it every single day. I reveled in it quietly, not because I wanted to punish, but because the universe had finally balanced itself, because truth, in its quiet, relentless way, had begun to assert itself. Because my presence alone was enough to disrupt the illusion, the ripple spreads beyond them. I noticed it in others, the silent observers, the ones who had watched the cycles and felt the exhaustion. They began to see what I had seen. They began to recognize the patterns. And slowly, quietly, they began to step away from the chaos, from the manipulation, from the energy vampires who thrived on reaction and drama. I had become the center of a quiet revolution, not loud, not violent, not imposed, but undeniable, unstoppable in its inevitability. The first ripple carries a choice. They could attempt to regain control. They could escalate, manipulate, fight, or they could recognize the truth, that the dynamic had shifted, that their access had been revoked, that the rules they had relied on no longer applied. And some tried, foolishly, desperately, throwing every tactic, every insult, every appeal, every attempt at guilt. But the ripples had become waves. And waves cannot be stopped by the same hands that controlled ponds. The first ripple is terrifying for them, because for the first time they see me as I am, not reactive, not pliable, not bound by their desires or expectations, but steady, unyielding, observant, and the ripple reveals their dependency. Their ego, their identity, their sense of power. It had relied on my reactions, on my engagement, on my willingness to participate in their games. And now there is no participation, no validation, no energy to feed upon. The ripple continues to grow. Every silence I maintain, every moment I refrain from reaction, every observation without intervention adds to the effect. The first ripple becomes many. The many become a current. The current becomes a tide, and the tide reshapes the landscape quietly but irreversibly. And I watch it unfold, because the power of change is not in confrontation. It is in restraint, in clarity, in patience. I am no longer the one reacting. I am the force that allows truth to assert itself. I am the calm that uncovers weakness. I am the observer who becomes the catalyst, and they will never forgive me for it, not because I hurt them, not because I struck, but because I refused to play the role they demanded, refused to dance to the rhythm they controlled, refused to give them what they needed to feel powerful. And that refusal, quiet, steady, absolute, is more destructive than any attack could ever be. The first ripple has become undeniable. It spreads to the manipulators, the observers, the hidden, the ignored. It reminds them that power is not given. It is recognized. It is earned. And when you withhold the energy they crave, you reclaim it for yourself. The ripples continue, subtle, silent, relentless. And I am at the center, untouchable, unshakable, unwavering. Because the first ripple taught me a truth that no betrayal, no insult, no manipulation could ever erase. You do not need to fight every battle. You do not need to prove yourself to the undeserving. You do not need to react. You only need to exist, observing, waiting, silent, and the world around you will change because of it. The first ripple is terrifying for them, liberating for you, and I have just begun. At some point, they stopped calling your name. Not because they didn't want to, but because it no longer worked. You became distant in a way that terrified them, not physically gone, not dramatically absent, but unreachable. And that is the most dangerous kind of disappearance. You didn't vanish in smoke or chaos. You faded in plain sight, right in front of them. You were there, but not available. That was when it began. The confusion, the restlessness, the quiet panic behind their eyes because they were used to access, used to reaching you. Used to pulling a reaction with a word, a look, a memory, a wound, and suddenly nothing. You became the ghost they couldn't touch, not because you were weak, but because you were done. They tried the old ways first, the familiar tactics, the casual messages, the half apologies, the subtle jabs disguised as jokes. Silence. They escalated, dramatically, emotionally, desperately, still silence. And that silence didn't feel empty. It felt intentional, heavy, final, because ghosts don't argue. Ghosts don't defend themselves. Ghosts don't explain. They simply exist beyond reach. You had crossed a line they couldn't follow, not into hatred, not into revenge, but into detachment. And detachment terrifies people who survive on control. They began to talk about you, more than they ever had before, not with clarity, with obsession. They tried to rewrite the story, paint themselves as victims, paint you as cold, cruel, arrogant, but something was wrong. The narrative didn't stick. Because ghosts don't defend themselves, and when there is no reaction, lies collapse under their own weight. They replayed old moments, old conversations, old versions of you, trying to summon the person who once answered, the one who explained, the one who cared enough to bleed out loud. But that version of you was gone, not dead, transformed. You had learned the most brutal lesson of all. Access is a privilege, not a right, and you revoked it. That is when they truly felt powerless. Because power doesn't come from strength alone. It comes from influence, from impact, from knowing you can still move someone and they couldn't move you anymore. No anger, no sadness, no forgiveness, no closure, just absence. And absence forces people to face themselves. They didn't miss you. They missed the version of themselves that felt powerful around you. They missed the mirror that reacted, the stage that responded, the audience that validated their performance. But the stage was dark now. You had become a shadow in their world, a presence they could feel but never grasp. They watched you change from a distance, quieter, sharper, more composed, and that scared them more than rage ever could, because rage is familiar, rage is predictable. Silence with clarity is not. You stopped explaining your choices, stopped correcting misunderstandings, stopped trying to be seen accurately by people committed to misunderstanding you. And that is when the balance tipped permanently. They reached out less, then more. Then less again, testing, probing, hoping. You remained unreachable, not blocked, not hostile, just unavailable. That subtle boundary was ruthless, because it said one thing clearly: I owe you nothing. And nothing wounds entitlement more deeply than indifference. You became the unanswered question in their mind, the loose thread they couldn't tie, the silence they couldn't interpret, and they filled it with fear. Fear that you saw them clearly now. Fear that you were no longer manipulable. Fear that the power dynamic had flipped forever. They wondered what you thought of them, what you remembered, what you understood. But ghosts don't clarify. Ghosts let people sit with their own projections. You watched all of this without engagement, without satisfaction, without cruelty. Because you weren't trying to hurt them, you were trying to protect yourself. And that distinction matters. This wasn't punishment, it was self-respect made visible. You had learned that silence isn't emptiness. It's a boundary that speaks louder than any argument. And in that silence, you grew stronger, clearer, more deliberate, less reactive. Your energy returned to you, your focus sharpened, your instincts woke back up. You were no longer leaking yourself into people who never valued the cost. You became selective, intentional, unreachable to those who only knew how to take. And that transformation changed everything, because ghosts don't chase, ghosts don't beg. Ghosts don't linger where they are not respected. They move forward, quietly, decisively. and the people left behind feel it like a chill. They sense the absence, the shift, the door that closed without a sound, and they realize something too late. You were never weak. You were just generous with access. And once that generosity ended, so did their control. You became the ghost they couldn't reach, not because you disappeared, but because you evolved beyond them. And that evolution is irreversible. They may talk, they may speculate, they may pretend they don't care, but the silence follows them. Because they know deep down they lost you not through conflict, but through neglect, through misuse, through entitlement, through taking one step too far. And now all they have is memory, while you have momentum. And momentum doesn't look back. They didn't give up quietly. People never do when they feel power slipping through their fingers. At first it was subtle, a message framed as concern, a memory dressed as nostalgia. A question pretending to care about your well-being. You saw it for what it was, a hook. They weren't reaching out to you. They were reaching for the version of you they could control. And when subtlety failed, they escalated. Guilt became the weapon of choice. You've changed. You're not the same anymore. I don't recognize you. They said it like an accusation, like growth was betrayal. But you didn't respond, because silence doesn't argue with manipulation. Silence lets it expose itself. Then came nostalgia. Carefully selected memories, moments where you were softer, more forgiving, easier to reach. They tried to pull you backward through time, but you weren't that person anymore. That version of you existed before clarity, before pattern recognition, before you understood the cost of staying accessible to people who only knew how to drain. And nostalgia collapsed under its own weight, so they changed tactics again. Urgency, crisis, emotional emergencies designed to trigger your instinct to rescue. They needed you back in the role, the listener, the fixer, the one who absorbed chaos so they didn't have to face it, but you stayed still, and that terrified them, because urgency loses power when it's not rewarded. Crisis becomes noise when it's no longer effective. They pushed harder. They framed themselves as victims. They rewrote the narrative. They hinted at consequences. They implied loss, still nothing. Your silence wasn't cold. It was final, not cruel, not dramatic, just immovable. And immovable things break those who push against them long enough. They began to unravel. Their words became inconsistent. Their emotions swung wildly. Affection turned to resentment. Apologies dissolved into accusations, and you watched without reaction. Because once you see the pattern, you can never unsee it. They weren't trying to reconnect. They were trying to regain access. Access to your empathy, your attention, your emotional labor. And you had closed the gate, not with anger, but with awareness. That's when the last tactic appeared. Fear. They warned you indirectly, of regret, of loneliness, of what happens when bridges burn, but you weren't burning anything. You were simply walking away from what was never safe to stand on, and deep down they knew it. That's why their fear grew louder, because fear recognizes truth before ego does. They sensed the permanence, the shift that couldn't be reversed, the silence that wasn't waiting to be broken, and that's when they panicked. Because people who rely on control cannot survive detachment, they reached for your sympathy one last time, one last emotional plea, one last attempt to make you feel responsible for their discomfort. But responsibility had changed hands. You were no longer responsible for their feelings, their reactions, their consequences. That weight belonged to them now, and you refused to carry it anymore. Your silence held, unmoved by tears, unmoved by rage, unmoved by guilt. Because silence, once rooted in self-respect, cannot be manipulated, they realized something too late. You weren't silent because you didn't care. You were silent because you finally cared about yourself. And that realization ended the chase, not with a confrontation, not with a final message, but with exhaustion. They ran out of tactics, out of leverage, out of ways to reach you. And what remains after desperation fails is acceptance. Not peace, not growth, just acceptance of loss. they lost access. They lost influence. They lost the version of you that once answered, and you gained something far more powerful: freedom, clarity, control. Your silence had evolved from protection to dominance, and there was nothing they could do about it. You expected emptiness. That's what they warned you about. That's what they predicted. That's what fear whispered when you finally stepped away. They said the world would shrink without them, that you would feel lost. That silence would swallow you whole, but something else happened. The noise stopped, and in that quiet, you heard yourself again. Your thoughts returned first, clear, undistorted, no longer interrupted by doubt planted by others. Then your energy followed. The exhaustion you thought was just life lifted. The weight you carried for everyone else slipped off your shoulders. You realized something shocking. You were never tired because you were weak. You were tired because you were surrounded by people who fed on access. And once access was gone, so was the drain. The world didn't collapse, it expanded. Your mornings felt different, lighter, focused. Your decisions sharpened, not rushed, not second-guessed, chosen. Silence wasn't loneliness anymore. It was space. Space to think, space to build, space to become. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, momentum began to form. Not loud, not announced, but real. You started moving forward without needing approval, without needing validation, without explaining yourself to anyone who hadn't earned clarity. And that terrified the past, because the past survives on repetition, on patterns staying intact, on you remaining predictable. But you were no longer predictable. You weren't reacting. You weren't defending. You weren't circling old arguments in your head at night. You were creating distance, not just from people, but from versions of yourself that no longer fit. And with that distance came power, real power, not dominance over others, dominance over yourself. Your emotions obeyed you now. Not suppressed, disciplined. You felt anger when it mattered, compassion when it was deserved, and silence when words would only leak energy. That balance changed everything. Opportunities appeared, not because the world suddenly became kind, but because your focus sharpened enough to see them. You said no without guilt, yes without fear. Your presence became intentional, your absence meaningful. People noticed the shift. They always do. Some felt inspired, some felt uneasy. Some felt exposed just being near you. Because when someone stops chasing, stops explaining, stops seeking permission, they force others to confront their own stagnation. And not everyone can handle that. You didn't announce your growth. You embodied it. You moved differently, spoke less, listened more. And when you did speak, your words landed, because silence had taught you restraint, and restraint commands attention. The world didn't end. The illusion did. The illusion that you needed chaos to feel alive. That you needed conflict to feel relevant. That you needed certain people to feel whole. You didn't lose connection. You refined it. You didn't lose love. You removed distortion. You didn't lose yourself. You reclaimed yourself. And the most dangerous part, you were just getting started. Your life began to move in alignment. Not perfect, not painless, but honest. And honesty, when paired with discipline, becomes unstoppable. You weren't loud about it. You weren't trying to prove anything. You simply lived, and that was enough to unsettle those who expected your collapse. They waited for regret, for a message, for a sign that you missed them. But all they saw was progress, calm, distance, momentum, and it confused them because they thought they were the center of your world. They weren't. They were a chapter, one you finished reading. The silence that once felt like loss now felt like command. You chose where your energy went, who had access, what deserved your attention, and that choice rewrote your future. You no longer asked, "What will they think?" You asked, "Does this move me forward?" And if the answer was no, you didn't hesitate. That decisiveness changed the trajectory of your life. The world didn't end. It finally made room for you. The cracks became impossible to hide at first. It was subtle, small fractures beneath the surface. Moments they laughed too loudly. Moments they spoke too fast. moments they contradicted themselves and didn't even notice. You saw it before anyone else did. Because once you stop reacting, once you step back from the noise, you begin to see patterns instead of performances. And patterns never lie. They try to maintain the illusion. They always do. People addicted to control believe the mask is permanent. They believe confidence can be rehearsed forever. But pressure exposes what performance hides, and the pressure was building. Your silence removed their balance. Your distance disrupted their rhythm. Your refusal to engage became weight they could no longer carry. So the cracks widened, their stories stopped lining up, their authority started sounding rehearsed, their confidence turned defensive. You noticed how often they spoke your name when you weren't there, how frequently they explained themselves to people who never asked, how aggressively they defended positions no one challenged. That's when you understood something crucial. People who are secure don't over-explain. People who are powerful don't perform strength. People who are whole don't fear absence. But they did. They feared your quiet more than they ever feared your anger, because anger gave them something to point at. Silence gave them nothing to hold, and without something to hold, they began to fall. You saw it in the impatience, the rushed decisions, the impulsive moves made just to feel in control again. They started revealing their hand too early, showing motives they once hid with charm, exposing desperation where dominance used to live. The cracks weren't just visible now, they were structural. You realized something almost unsettling. They were never strong, they were never stable, they were never in control. They were just louder than everyone else. And loudness is easy to mistake for power until it starts to shake. Their behavior became inconsistent, their alliances unstable, their confidence brittle. They overreached, they misjudged, they underestimated how much of their authority depended on your participation, because you were never the problem, you were the stabilizer. You were the one absorbing tension, the one diffusing chaos, the one making their dysfunction look like leadership. And when you stepped away, their flaws had nowhere left to hide. That's when the panic truly set in. They tried to regain control through force, through pressure, through intimidation disguised as concern, but it was too late. People had started noticing, not because you warned them, not because you exposed anything, but because the cracks spoke for themselves. The tone changed, the energy shifted. The room felt different when they entered, and once people feel a shift, they can't unfeel it. You watched from a distance, calm and detached, as their influence weakened. Not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily, irreversibly, the way erosion works. They started losing credibility in small moments, a careless contradiction, an emotional outburst where composure was expected, a decision rooted in ego instead of clarity. Each moment insignificant alone, devastating together. And the most satisfying part, you didn't need revenge, you didn't need validation, you didn't need acknowledgement. Truth was doing the work for you. That's the thing about truth. It doesn't rush, it doesn't argue, it doesn't defend itself, it waits. And eventually, everything false collapses under its own weight. They could feel it slipping. You could see it in their eyes, the frantic need to be seen as relevant, the hunger for reassurance. The subtle hostility toward anyone who no longer mirrored admiration. Their world was shrinking, and yours was expanding in silence. You were no longer tangled in their instability, no longer reacting to their provocations, no longer explaining your worth to people invested in misunderstanding it. You had moved beyond the need to win, and that is the most dangerous position of all, because when someone no longer needs approval, they become uncontrollable. The cracks kept spreading. Relationships fractured, trust eroded, authority dissolved into performance, and eventually others began stepping back too, not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, the same way you did. That's when the truth became undeniable. your silence didn't just expose them, it taught others how to see. And once people learn how to see, they can never go back to being blind. You weren't replaced. You were understood too late to stop what was already unfolding. Their influence became hollow. Their words lost weight. Their presence no longer commanded the room, because power built on illusion always collapses, and power built on self-mastery, that only grows stronger in the shadows. You didn't destroy them. You didn't need to. They collapsed under the weight of who they truly were once you stopped carrying it for them. And in that moment, something settled inside you, a certainty, a calm, a quiet dominance that required no audience. The cracks were no longer your concern. You had already moved beyond the ruins. They tried to rewrite the narrative and failed. They tried. Oh, they tried. With every ounce of desperation, they scrambled to control the story, to rearrange events, to retell reality in the version where they were still the heroes and you were the problem. But stories have a weight, and truth always presses against lies. It has gravity. It settles in the corners of a room, in the whispers of those who watch, in the spaces between words and actions. They started subtle, a misstatement here, an omission there, a carefully placed suggestion that maybe you had misunderstood, maybe you had overreacted, maybe you were the one out of step with reality. At first, it was almost believable, almost convincing, but you weren't naive. You had already stepped outside their orbit. You had already pulled your energy back. You had already observed everything without reacting. And from that perspective, the cracks in their lies became as clear as shattered glass. They spun narratives like spiders weaving fragile webs, each strand meant to trap the unsuspecting, each lie carefully aligned to cover another, each distortion dependent on silence, your silence. But silence is not ignorance. Silence is a mirror, and they couldn't see themselves. They didn't understand that the world outside their ego was watching too. That people noticed when words no longer matched actions. That people listened for tone, for consistency, for integrity. And integrity cannot be faked forever, so they pushed harder. Louder stories, manipulative charm, false displays of control. They tried to shame, they tried to guilt, they tried to create doubt. But the harder they pushed, the more obvious their desperation became. The cracks weren't hiding anymore. They were screaming. They rewrote the narrative. But the pages were already inked in reality. The audience had already read it, and the words didn't match their actions. Every lie they told was just another weight on their shoulders. Every distortion was another nail in the coffin of credibility. You watched it unfold with cold precision, because you no longer needed to defend yourself. You no longer needed to clarify. You no longer needed to react. And that, above all, was their undoing. They assumed chaos would confuse you. They assumed misdirection would shake your calm. They assumed the world could be convinced that truth was subjective, that lies could become reality if shouted loud enough. But truth doesn't require volume. It doesn't require applause. It doesn't bend to desire. Truth exists. It accumulates. It waits patiently. And eventually it stands alone, unshaken by distortion, undeterred by manipulation, unmoved by fear. They failed because they didn't anticipate one thing. You were no longer part of the story they could control. You had removed yourself from their stage. You had stepped off the set. You had exited the narrative entirely. And once you left, their world began to crumble. Not with a bang, but with the slow, relentless realization that influence depends on audience. Power depends on participation. No one participates for long in a play where the lead has already walked away. And so the rewrites were futile. Every accusation bounced off a shield of self-possession. Every attempt at manipulation folded under the weight of observation. Every effort to frame you as the villain backfired because reality cannot be framed by liars. They tried to rewrite the past. but history remembers. It remembers the tone of voice, the eyes that watched silently, the actions that contradicted the story. They tried to rewrite the present, but the present cannot be claimed by those unwilling to see. Their attempts only highlighted their insecurities, their greed for control, their fear of exposure. They tried to rewrite the narrative, and in failing, they exposed themselves completely. People started noticing. Whispers became murmurs, murmurs became questions, questions became quiet conclusions. Their credibility eroded, their influence waned, their authority was hollow. And you didn't intervene, you didn't shout corrections, you didn't reveal all that you saw, you didn't need to, because silence had become your power, observation had become your weapon, patience had become your dominance, and in that silence the truth became undeniable. They had failed, not because you crushed them, not because you fought, not because you exposed them, but because they had revealed themselves and nothing could hide who they were anymore. Your quiet was louder than their lies. Your absence was heavier than their presence. Your calm was sharper than their panic. They tried to manipulate the story, to shape perception, to bend reality. But reality bends only to truth. And truth had been your constant companion. They tried, and they failed. The more they struggled, the more apparent it became to everyone watching that their power was a performance. Their control a facade, their confidence fragile and desperate. You didn't have to act, you didn't have to react, you didn't have to intervene. The universe, it seemed, had a way of finishing the story for those who refused to participate in lies. And so they crumbled, quietly, inevitably, while you observed, unmoved, unshaken, untouchable. They tried to rewrite the narrative and failed. And in their failure, you found clarity, you found power, you found freedom. Because the story they could not control was the one that mattered most, yours. They realized control was an illusion control. They thought they had it. Every meeting, every word, every glance, every expectation. They believed the world bent to their design. They believed influence was the same as power. They believed domination came from noise, from presence, from manipulation. They were wrong, because control is an illusion, a mirage shimmering just beyond reach, a shadow that vanishes when you step toward it. And the moment they realized it, everything began to shift. They had built their empire on reactions, on obedience, on fear, on compliance, on the fragile belief that people would remain predictably predictable. They hadn't counted on one thing, you. You who stepped away, you who withdrew your energy, you who refused to play the game, you who watched instead of reacting. And suddenly, the illusion of control started to crumble. Every plan they had depended on you bending, responding, giving them power. Every scheme relied on your participation. Every manipulation required your energy to fuel it. But you stopped participating. And in that silence, in that absence, the truth revealed itself like lightning tearing the sky. They never controlled anything. Not you, not perception, not reality. Control was a performance, a mask, a lie they told themselves to feel safe, to feel powerful. And the moment they understood it, panic set in. They scanned the room, they measured reactions, they searched for influence, but found only observation. You were still there, but you were untouchable, unmoved, unshaken. They realized they had been performing for an audience that no longer existed. They realized every attempt to manipulate was meaningless. They realized every word had bounced off a wall of quiet indifference. And in that realization, fear grew. Because humans fear what they cannot control. They fear chaos. They fear unpredictability. They fear the ones who cannot be bent, bought, or broken. And you became that fear. Your calm was the blade they could not see. Your silence was the trap they could not escape. Your patience was the weight that crushed the foundation of their lies. They had constructed an elaborate illusion. They had told themselves they were powerful because no one dared to challenge them. But the challenge had come, quiet, invisible, unyielding, and it didn't scream, it didn't strike, it didn't retaliate, it merely existed. And that existence was more terrifying than any attack, more powerful than any word, more irreversibly damaging than any exposure. Because control is never about the one who speaks. It is about the one who listens. It is about the one who chooses. It is about the one who can walk away and remain untouched. And you had walked away. They realized too late that control is a reflection, a mirror, and they had only ever controlled themselves. They had only ever controlled their projection. They had never controlled the truth. The walls they built around themselves, around influence, authority, perception, began to tremble. The scaffolding of lies they depended on was unstable. The script they clung to, rehearsed, repeated, was now irrelevant because the audience had changed. The player had changed. The rules had changed. They tried to recapture the narrative. They tried to force reactions. They tried to reconstruct the illusion of control. But illusions cannot be reconstructed once broken. Masks cannot be reapplied once removed. The spell cannot be recast once it has dissipated. They understood it. They realized their power was a lie. And lies, once revealed, have only one consequence: collapse. They panicked because they had invested everything in a story that no longer mattered. They had traded truth for influence. They had traded reality for perception, and perception is fleeting. Control had never existed. It had only been an idea, a shadow on the wall of their ambition, and shadows vanish in the presence of stillness. You had become still, and in stillness, everything they built fell apart. Their strategies failed, their manipulations failed, their attempts at dominance failed, their narrative failed. They were exposed, not by force, not by attack, not by noise, but by indifference, by calm, by silence, by the quiet power of someone who refused to participate in the illusion. They realized they could not control you. They realized they could not bend reality to their desire. They realized their influence was a house of cards built on sand with no foundation in truth, and fear turned to awe. Fear turned to despair, because they understood something critical. You had power, real power, not the fake, performative power they craved, not the power of manipulation or fear, but the power to observe, to withhold, to exist without being corrupted by their chaos. They had forgotten one rule of the world: true strength is invisible, true dominance is silent. True control is self-possession, and you had it. The moment they realized it, they lost their footing. Every attempt to regain control was weak, desperate, hollow. Every word they spoke was a trembling echo. Every move they made was transparent, obvious, predictable, because they were no longer controlling anything. You were untouchable. The story was yours. The stage was empty of their authority, and the illusion was gone. They realized, finally, that control is not granted. It is not inherited. It is not demanded. Control is only ever an illusion, and illusions vanish when the observer refuses to be fooled. And you had refused. They tried to hold the world in their hands, but the world slipped away because you stopped reacting. You stopped feeding the story. You stopped participating in their performance. And in that moment, they realized the truth. Control is never given to those who seek it. Control is claimed by those who don't need it. And you had claimed it. They saw it in your eyes. They felt it in your presence. They recognized it in your calm. And in that recognition, they fell silent, because the illusion was gone, because the mask had slipped, because the shadow of power they clung to was only a shadow, and shadows vanish in the light of indifference. They realized control was an illusion, and they could do nothing about it. And in that nothing, you found everything. Everything: power, peace, clarity, freedom, victory. They had tried to dominate. They had tried to bend the world to their will. They had tried to rewrite the story. They had tried to manipulate, to frighten, to deceive. And yet, all they left you with was a truth they could never touch. You are the one who remains. You are the one who cannot be controlled. You are the one who wins without striking. They realized control was an illusion, and in that realization, they failed utterly. While you stood silent, observing, unshaken, untouchable. The world watches as they unravel. The world is watching, and they can see it, every flicker of panic, every tremor of disbelief, every crack in the mask they once thought unbreakable. The puppet strings are cut. The stage is empty of their command. The echoes of their authority bounce off walls that no longer exist, and the world it notices, because everyone can see the collapse. Everyone can feel the tremors of their unraveling. Everyone senses the weakness they spent a lifetime hiding. You are silent, you are still, you are calm, and in that calm, the power is yours. Because while they scramble to maintain a facade, you observe, you learn, you rise. They thought their influence extended beyond reason.